Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Artemis Kirk, University Librarian at Georgetown, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. We have the special pleasure of hearing from one of Georgetown's own faculty members, Karen Stohr, author, professor in the philosophy department, and senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. Professor Stohr's primary research interests are in Aristotelian virtue ethics and Kantian ethics, with publications on topics such as moral emotion and imagination, the virtue of practical wisdom, and the duty of beneficence. She has always been interested in the practical side of ethics, especially the moral dimensions of ordinary social interactions, which formed the basis of her 2011 book on manners. She's going to be talking about that book this evening, so I'm not going to spoil any surprises, but I will say that it will make you look at etiquette in a whole new light. Professor Stohr holds an undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame and graduate degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's been teaching at Georgetown since 2002. She lives in suburban Maryland with her husband and 2 daughters. We're very grateful to Professor Stohr for agreeing to speak with us this evening, and I will give her the floor in just a moment. It's a particular pleasure when we can highlight a member of the Georgetown faculty whose research, publications, and scholarly pursuits the library supports through our access to resources and much more. Please join me tonight in welcoming Professor Karen Stohr.
So thank you to Artemis for that lovely introduction, and to everybody else who's made this event possible tonight. And thank you to all of you for coming. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And whether you're here because you think, like me, that manners matter, or whether because you think they don't matter and you want to argue about that, that's wonderful. And I'm looking forward to a good discussion in the question and answer period. So many people think that manners and etiquette are all about forks. And in fact, this is one of the dominant themes about etiquette. Well, it's about forks, and forks are confusing. And I actually do think that there is something to be said about forks, and I will say something about forks at the very end. But I don't think, as one of the posters for this event said, that manners and etiquette are entirely about forks, or even for that matter, mostly about forks, or at least we shouldn't think of it as being mostly about forks. I think that this tendency to think about manners and etiquette about forks, not knives or spoons for some reason, just forks, the reason for it has to do that people think of manners perhaps from their own experiences as being perhaps a bit oppressive, or perhaps trivial, or maybe even hypocritical. I don't think that manners have to be oppressive, and I definitely don't think that they're trivial, and at least that they're not always hypocritical, and I'll say more about each of those things. But first, I want to just say a bit about the role of manners and philosophy in history, because for many people, this seems like a surprising topic for a philosopher to be interested in. What does philosophy, which people tend to think about as being abstract and about really important subjects, or maybe not very important subjects, but very deep subjects, and manners, which people tend to think about as being perhaps sort of light and fluffy, the sort of thing one reads about in the style section of the Washington Post. So you might wonder why anybody would be interested in trying to combine these two subjects. The fact that these subjects seem so disparate, the concerns of philosophy and the concerns of manners, is actually a comparatively new phenomenon. In history, up until quite recently, philosophers have actually, at least many philosophers, have been quite interested in questions of manners. This is for different reasons, and certainly very often with different kinds of background assumptions. So for instance, 2 of the philosophers who had many things to say about manners, David Hume, who thought that manners improved a lot of things about social life, but also were sort of a reflection of our natural tendencies to be sociable and to look for people who are agreeable and who please us and can help smooth social interactions. And then maybe holding down the other side of the fence is the 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who took a sort of dimmer view about human nature and famously described manners as a way, in terms of a fable of what's called the fable of the porcupines. So he thought about the experience of porcupines in social groups. So they have to huddle together for warmth. I don't mind cell phones, actually. They have to huddle together for warmth, but yet when they get too close to each other, they prick each other with their quills. And so social life is about trying to find the right distance where you're close enough that you can derive the benefits of being close together, but not so close to each other that you drive each other crazy. But in both cases, and it wasn't just human Schopenhauer, this was also true of Aristotle and Immanuel Kant, who I will say more about later, they sort of took for granted that it was important, or at least it wasn't out of the domain of philosophical concerns to think about manners in social life. Now, this changed for a number of different reasons around the beginning of the 20th century, and this is partly having to do with philosophical trends. And it may seem strange to think of something like a philosophical trend because things don't change very fast in philosophy. It takes us a long time for trends to come about. But at the beginning of the 20th, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, in American or English-speaking philosophy, there was a trend toward thinking about philosophy, and especially thinking about ethics in a more abstract way, a way that was a bit more divorced from sort of the concerns of ordinary life. And that trend continued for quite some time. And only recently, in about the last, for us, this is recent, the last 40 or 50 years, has that changed. I think this is really unfortunate for philosophy and ethics in particular, but also for the study of manners. And it's particularly unfortunate because what happened to etiquette during that time period and the study of manners was actually quite interesting. So probably everyone here is familiar with the name Emily Post, I'm guessing. Most people are. Emily Post in 1950 was actually in a survey of women reporters. She was actually voted the second most influential woman in America after Eleanor Roosevelt, whom she actually didn't like very much, but that's another story. And the Emily Post story is very interesting. I think she's actually one of the, a much more interesting woman than people often realize. And her story is interesting because one of the things that she accomplished in her writing is a kind of transformation of etiquette out of the kind of stuffy mold that people associated with etiquette in the upper crust, although she herself was a member of that upper crust, and transformed it into something else over the course of her writings. And in particular, she turned it into something that we might sort of call a kind of populist approach to etiquette. So when Post started writing in the 1920s, it was of course a time of great change. The preceding decades had been a time of great change in American social life. There were many new waves of immigrants and lots of people looking for ways to fit into the new society that they had entered into. And many of them turned, for lots of reasons, to people like Emily Post. So Post herself was a member, definitely, of the upper crust of New York society. And she started out when writing her etiquette books as sort of reporting on what that society did. But she was a very smart woman and a really interesting thinker. And over time, her ideas about etiquette transformed and changed until she started writing about etiquette as something that everybody had reason to be interested in. It was in some ways a very democratic approach to etiquette. She really believed that etiquette was important to the way that we conduct our ordinary lives. And because of Emily Post's stature and her influence on etiquette, this had a profound effect on the way that etiquette was seen and discussed in American culture. One way of seeing Emily Post is as someone who's trying to put forward a distinctively American way of exercising good manners. Okay, so let's now fast forward a few decades to the contemporary age. So one of the things that everybody notices in the newspapers and on the radio and on TV is that there's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth about the incivility of our current age. Now, just about every age has done a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth about the incivility of their current age. So it's not as if this is something new. But it is true, or at least it seems to be true as far as I can tell, that it's in some ways easier to be uncivil than it ever was before. And this is in part, of course, because of the internet age. It's a lot easier to be anonymous, although maybe not as easy to be anonymous as certain military leaders would like it to be. But it's easier than it used to be. Because there are so many ways in which we interact with people that we may never see again. For those of you who, like me, spend time driving on the Beltway, we all know how this goes, right? Someone cuts you off in traffic, you cut someone else off in traffic, you never see them again, who cares? But at the same time, that also in many ways seems more important than ever before. This is in part because our society is, of course, increasingly cosmopolitan. It's increasingly multicultural. We have people coming from a variety of walks of life and a variety of cultures coming together, and we need to know how to interact with people in a way that makes sense, and I'm going to come back to that. And there's also, of course, the advent of many new technologies that require us to come up with new conventions. So Emily Post had nothing to say about texting, not surprisingly, right? Or about netiquette, the new phrase that's come up because of people's wondering about how you interact on the internet. So there are all these new technologies that call for new kinds of conventions, and of course this isn't a brand new thing. There have always been new technologies that have called for new conventions, but we've gotten a whole bunch of them at once. And so it seems to be a pressing concern in that area too. All right, so we need etiquette, I think, still, perhaps more than ever. But why do we need philosophy? Why not leave things as they started in the beginning of the 20th century and consider these to be distinct domains? Well, for me, there's a piece of background about how I came to be interested in these things. I've always loved reading advice columns. I can't remember a time from the first time my parents let me read Ann Landers and Dear Abby, I was reading them. I was really interested, and I've always been a huge fan of Judith Martin, otherwise known as Miss Manners. So I've always been interested in that. I haven't always been interested in philosophy or ethics, and for a long time, even after I became a philosopher and started working in moral philosophy, I didn't really see those two interests as having much to do with each other. There was my sideline interest in etiquette and manners and advice columns, and then there was my sort of real work in philosophy. But these two things over time started merging as a result of a number of things. One is that I taught a class, an undergraduate class here on morality and manners. It was a total blast. And it was in teaching that class that I realized there were more intersections than I had thought. But there are three other things that I started to notice about etiquette and manners, and on the one hand, and morality and ethics on the other. By the way, I use the phrase morality and ethics, those two terms, interchangeably. That is, in fact, what most ethicists, moral philosophers do. I know it's not the way that a lot of people use those, but just so you know, I flip them around. Manners and etiquette, right now I'm using interchangeably, but that's going to change in a few minutes. I usually talk about ethics and etiquette and manners and morality because I like alliteration, but not much is hanging on that right now. Okay, so there were three things that I noticed about these two interests, about my interest in manners and my interest in morality. One, and perhaps this is the most obvious of the three, is they both really matter to people. Now, of course, morality matters, we hope, to people, so everybody's aware of that. But it's also, I think, pretty clearly true that manners matter to people too, that people care about politeness. And you can see this in part because of the popularity of those advice columns that I like to read. Pretty much every major newspaper runs an advice column of some kind or other. Many run several. Some, like the New York Times and the Boston Globe, have their own columnists. Others syndicate them. There are also quite a few television shows. In the book, I talk quite a bit about the television show Seinfeld. This is partly a product of the age at which I started watching lots of TV. But there's a number of other shows, including Curb Your Enthusiasm and The Office, that have become really popular, that are mostly about conventions and social life. And I think for many of us, questions about etiquette and politeness occupy a lot of mental space. They occupy a lot of mental space for me, particularly in my commute, because I'm often thinking about etiquette rules when I'm on the Beltway. But they do occupy a lot of our collective attention. Now, the fact that we do care a lot about polite behavior, at least many of us do, doesn't show that we should. It might be that we're getting really, really focused on something that doesn't matter. But I don't think we should be so quick to assume that, right? That it doesn't actually matter, that it's really trivial, or that it's outdated because it includes a lot of rules about things that many of us don't even care about anymore, like what glove length you should wear for various social occasions, because I don't wear gloves. But I think this would be too quick for a number of reasons. One is that if we just think about the ways in which the rules that etiquette that we have, the way in which they structure our society, and the importance that they've taken on at various points in our society, we should know that there's something important here. So let me just take an example. Everybody is familiar with Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. So there's a paragraph in that letter where he details the many terrible things that African Americans have been subjected to: lynchings, police violence, segregation. And he lists something else. The fact that, as he says, his wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs. Right? So among that list of things that are pretty clearly moral issues, like lynchings, we also have this point about titles. And it may seem like a bit of a mismatch, but of course it's not, because King was rightly pointing out the fact that this seemingly kind of trivial thing, the fact that African American women weren't given a title that other women were given, was in fact something pretty significant. Right? And it was significant because it showed a level of disrespect that he was aware of. Not the same level of disrespect, perhaps, as the other things that he mentions. But it mattered enough to him that he mentioned it in that letter, and that, I think, is significant. So the second thing that I noticed is that there's a tremendous amount of overlap in the concerns between morality on the one hand and manners on the other hand. So if we think about the extremes here, so one extreme, right, one rule of etiquette that people often know, may not abide by, not to wear white shoes after Labor Day. People know this one, okay? So I'm taking that as one extreme. And here's another extreme: don't kill people, okay? So don't kill people seems like a pretty fundamental moral rule if there ever was one, right? A quite weighty one. And the don't wear white shoes after Labor Day seems like a pretty trivial one. I'll come back to that one too. Now, if these are your paradigms, then of course, manners is going to look really trivial, because compared to killing people, the color of your shoes is pretty trivial. But of course, that's not the entirety of either morality or etiquette. And in fact, most of our everyday interactions lie somewhere in between. And in practice, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between those things. So take an example of being at a social event and somebody cracks a joke that is ever so slightly racist. Right? Not like really overtly racist, but a little racist. So do you have an etiquette problem on your hands? Or do you have an ethics problem on your hand? Or do you have sort of, I think, both on your hands, right? You do have an ethics problem because responding to racism is an ethical issue, but you also have an etiquette problem because you have to figure out what to do about it. What do you say that will be effective? The third area, the third thing that I noticed, the reason for thinking these merge, is that the questions of ethics and the questions of etiquette have more in common than you might think. There are questions about the justification of morality that philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about. Most people don't spend as much time worrying about them as philosophers do, but philosophers worry about it a lot. Why should I be moral? Why shouldn't I kill people? Why should I tell the truth, not cheat on my income tax returns if I don't think the IRS will catch me? In the case of students, why not cheat on your philosophy papers, buy them off an internet site? There's a parallel question about why we should be polite. Right? Who cares if we follow these rules or conventions? Does it matter? Right? Is there any reason that I have, apart from the fact that I want people to like me or I want to get some particular job, to be polite? And the questions are very much, they have the same form. They're both questions asking for justification. What's the justification of these principles and rules and norms that we abide by? And one of the things that's so clever about Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm is that it raises those questions about justification all the time. So the show, Seinfeld, was called a show about nothing, but it's not, actually. It's a show about a bunch of little things. And the show is so popular in part because there are characters who keep pressing on these things. Why should I abide by these rules and conventions? Why should they matter? So there are questions about justification that are very similar between morality or ethics and manners and etiquette on the one hand. There are also questions about expertise and authority. So everybody with kids is familiar with the incessant asking of children asking why they need to do things and the temptation of a parent to say, because I said to do it, that's why. And everybody knows that kids don't really buy that anyway. This idea, right, that there are rules out there, which is a common view about both etiquette and ethics, naturally leads to the question of where these rules come from and whose rules are they and who gets to decide what the rules are. Now, we don't often phrase it that way in terms of ethics, although it's a fair question, right? Who is the authority? But philosophers are very concerned with questions about, well, who's a moral expert? If you needed a moral expert, if you need a bioethicist, if you need a business ethicist, or you need an expert in anything, where do you find one? Right? Is it in the philosophy department? Is it somewhere else? Who are they? There are parallel questions in etiquette about etiquette experts. There are people that we all recognize probably as etiquette experts, but we can raise questions about what makes them experts in etiquette. What is it that they know? Right? How did they get to be experts? Why should we do something just because Miss Manners tells us to do it? So there's parallel questions about justification and expertise between ethics and etiquette. And because I'm interested in the questions about those in philosophy and interested in those questions in etiquette, the two merge. So let me tell you my view about the relationship between morality and manners in a nutshell. I think that, as is probably evident by now, that they're part of the same enterprise, that it's not a clear distinction, that they're really not different, distinct domains of inquiry. I think of manners as being how we might wear our moral commitments on the outside. Okay? A person's manners tell us who she is and what matters to her. There is a distinction that I borrowed from Judith Martin, which I like very much, between what she calls the principles of manners and the rules of etiquette. So Martin says that the principles of manners are sort of the underlying principles or aims or commitments, and the rules of etiquette are the specific versions of those that can vary across cultures. I think this is a useful distinction because the way that I think about this relationship between manners and morality is that the principles of manners are essentially moral principles, like show respect for people, be considerate of people. And the rules of etiquette are ways of communicating those moral attitudes in ways that other people can understand them. So let me give you an example. So we live in a culture in Washington, D.C., and in most of the United States, where standing in line is a very important convention. Now, we may have debates about where you have to stand in line, particularly in cars, like what counts as a line and so forth, but we have this idea about standing in line. And if somebody cuts to the front of the line and they're not bleeding to death or in some other state that seems to warrant it, we think of that as being rude. There are ways of explaining this, other than just saying it's rude. There are ways of explaining why this is rude that call upon the resources of moral philosophy in ways that I think are useful. So here, I want to call upon the resources of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. So Kant is very famous for a moral principle that he labeled the categorical imperative. That's a very fancy name for a principle that turns out not to be that complicated in practice. But Kant thought that what morality requires of us is that we see ourselves as being the moral equals of everybody else, at least of all other rational agents. Kant thought that when I think about why I matter, the source of my own moral standing, and I recognize for him it rests in my rationality and my capacity to set ends and goals and projects for myself. And Kant thought that morality consisted, basically, in recognizing that fact about myself and also recognizing that fact about other people. Recognizing that we are equals insofar as we all have that standing. And so if we apply this, or think about this in the context of line cutting, Kant famously articulated his categorical imperative. There's a bunch of ways of thinking about it for him, but one of the formulations says that if you want to know whether your action is permissible or not, you should do what he calls universalize the maxim. So you should think to yourself, what is it that I am proposing or planning to do here? And once you've located that, try to imagine everybody else acting on the same maxim. So if your maxim is, I'm going to sneak up to the front of the line because I'm in a hurry and I've got some things to do this afternoon and I really don't feel like waiting in this long line. So if we apply Kant's test in the categorical imperative and say to ourselves, well, what would happen? So this is the maxim that I want to act on. What would happen if everybody else acted on that maxim? Kant thought that if your maxim was permissible, if it was okay to act as you're planning to act, then you should be able to universalize that maxim. However, if universalizing the maxim causes problems of a certain kind, this tells you something about your reasoning. Kant thought that if you try to universalize certain maxims, what you're going to find is that your action that you're proposing to act on is no longer going to work. So, take an example of lines. If everybody has it as their maxim that they're going to cut to the front of the line whenever they're in a hurry or they don't feel like waiting in the line, what happens to the lines? They disappear. They don't exist anymore. The line turns into a mob. And Kant thinks that this reveals something about what we're proposing to do, that basically I am proposing to make an exception of myself. I want everybody else to abide by the rule of standing in line, but I'm going to jump to the front of the line. So I want everybody else to abide by that rule, but I intend to break that rule without having anything to offer to everybody else as a reason, like I'm bleeding to death or I'm about to discover a cure for cancer, or something like that. So Kant thought that this was important because it revealed something very important about how we're thinking about ourselves in relationship to other people. And if we think about this idea that many of us share, that cutting to the front of a line is rude, we can see that if we employ some of the tools of philosophy, we can say something a little bit more than that. Because Kant can give us a foothold into what's wrong with being rude in this circumstance. If we think about it in terms of Kant's categorical imperative, we can see that when I cut to the front of the line, right, I'm expressing something. I'm expressing an attitude that I am more important than everybody else. Right? And for Kant, this is both morally wrong. He also thought it was irrational because it's just not true. Right? But when I cut to the front of the line, particularly if I do so blatantly in a way that others can see, right, it's not just that it is rude, but it's also disrespectful in a way that we can explain with the resources of Kant. Now, of course, there are cultural variations here. Not every culture thinks it's important to stand in line. Some cultures take that more seriously than others. So in some cultures, cutting to the front of the line doesn't communicate disrespect at all. But in cultures like this one, where it does, then we have reason to follow that convention, to abide by that convention. And, I argue in the book, moral reason to follow it, because standing in a line is a way of communicating something to the other people in the line. Namely, I don't think I'm more important than the rest of you. And it's important to convey those things. Now, this is not to say that all rules of etiquette carry that kind of moral weight. I picked one that's pretty easy to put in terms of respect. White shoes after Labor Day is a little bit tougher because it's kind of hard to see why that would be disrespectful. I think you could actually give some weight to that. And I've just started thinking about this, so I don't have a full-fledged argument about it. But it strikes me that there might be some sort of moral reason to do something like contribute to a sense of occasion. So if you think about this in the context of weddings and funerals, where the places where we take standards of dress most seriously, right? We think that if a wedding invitation calls for black tie or something, that people should do it, right? Because they want to create this environment. And likewise, as we all recognize, there are standards of dress that we have to adhere to for funerals because funerals are supposed to be solemn occasions. So I think you might actually be able to make a very small case about the shoes and Labor Day and the idea that we should contribute to a sense of occasion with summer either beginning or ending in other seasons, but it wouldn't be a very strong case. So some of the rules are going to turn out to be more significant than others because some of them are going to be more closely tied to moral principles than others. The more closely a rule of etiquette is tied to a moral attitude, and the more that those rules of etiquette communicate or convey those attitudes, the more important it is to follow them. Now, something interesting, I think, happens when we think about morality this way, when we think about the rules of etiquette as conventions, definitely conventions, right? But conventions that have the backing of moral principles behind them, then etiquette turns into something else. For one thing, it becomes much more than what's just written down in etiquette books. It's more than just a list of rules. And actually, all good etiquette experts who have written books worth reading on the topic of etiquette have thought of it this way. This includes Emily Post and Judith Martin and Letitia Baldridge and others too. But there's something more about this that's helpful, because thinking about the rules of etiquette in these moral terms helps us do things with these conventions. In particular, it helps us see which of the conventions we should be following and which of them need to be dropped or taken off the books or updated. So one of the things that this way of thinking about the rules of etiquette, not as just sort of arbitrary conventions that are written down in a book, but as having the backing of moral principles, is that it gives us a way of looking at that convention that Martin Luther King was complaining about and saying, yeah, actually, we can see why that's a very bad convention, right? That's a convention, even if it was true at the time that etiquette books, and they may have said, right, that you would dress people of certain color by this title and others by another title, if those were the established practices. This way of thinking about morality, or sorry, this way of thinking about etiquette gives us a way of criticizing that. Because in this case, right, as our understanding of respect and equality evolved slowly over time, it became clear that those particular conventions weren't in fact expressing respect for all as equals. They were, of course, undermining it. And so thinking about manners and morality this way, of having that connection, gives us a way of criticizing certain social conventions and saying we ought to get rid of these and replace them with others that more accurately reflect our moral ideas. One other point about thinking of etiquette this way is it becomes clear, as everybody knows, there is no such thing as an etiquette book that can cover all possible situations, all possible etiquette violations or etiquette rules that have to be followed. And one of the things that this way of thinking about etiquette also helps us see is the importance of improvisation when it comes to etiquette. And in fact, if you read good etiquette books, if those of you who are fans of Judith Martin, who I think is really good at this, will see that one of the things that she does very well is she takes etiquette rules, but recognizes there are times in which following a particular etiquette rule would actually undermine the point of what the practice is. And in those cases, she thinks, rightly in my view, that there's good reason not to follow that etiquette rule, to do something else instead. Or there are times in which the rules of etiquette run out and we find ourselves facing new situations that call for new rules. And so etiquette on this view, because the rules of etiquette are supposed to be communicating certain kinds of moral attitudes and ideas and aims, when the particular rules in place don't have that effect, we have good reason not to follow them. And so thinking about etiquette and etiquette expertise on this view turns out to be something very much akin, as I argue in the book, to this Aristotelian virtue known as practical wisdom, which in a nutshell is the ability to know what matters, to see when it's mattering in a particular situation, and act in a way that reflects what matters. And it's a very important virtue in Aristotle, and I think it's a very important virtue in etiquette too. This way of thinking about etiquette and the underlying principles also provides us a way of updating our conventions and practices to keep up with changing attitudes. So texting, I always have conversations with students about the conventions of texting because they always, well, I think they always change. They change less than I think they do, actually, but I'm always asking them, so when's it rude to text somebody? And one of the things that becomes clear to me is there's a variant, those of you who have who spend a lot of time with college students know, there's actually quite sort of well-constructed rules about this. So I always ask and I confirm, is it rude to break up with somebody over texting? And they all say, yes, this is a terrible thing to do, right? You can tell someone that somebody has died text messaging, but you may not break up with them over text message. But students seem, if there are students here who want to argue with me on this, they certainly can, very committed to these. And there are reasons behind it, right, that have to do with the seriousness of things or trying to be considerate to people in various ways. And so one of the helpful things, I think, about thinking about etiquette as kinds of instantiations of principles of manners is it gives us sort of a way forward with new technologies and new situations and new etiquette problems. So in the book, and I've said much more about this in the book, and I won't say more about that now, but the general idea is that these two subjects of ethics or morality and etiquette and manners are much more intertwined than we might think they are. And in fact, I don't actually think you can do one very well without thinking about the other one. I think, and I've argued here, that thinking about rules of etiquette in moral terms is really helpful to helping us sort out which rules of etiquette are worth following and which ones aren't. And I also think that thinking about etiquette and thinking about practical problems sheds a lot of light on moral philosophy, that it helps us think better about the subject of ethics. Because I think that ethics as an academic subject is supposed to be responsive to the ways in which we actually live. And if it's not, then it's not a very good ethical theory. So I think that thinking about practical problems and what we think counts as a good answer to a practical problem helps inform the more abstract study of philosophical ethics. So that's the first part of the book, is an articulation of these themes and arguments. And then there's a number of other, in the rest of the book, chapters, there's specific topics on which I just either happen to be interested, or in which there are things, philosophical problems that I think are interesting. And if anyone wants to talk more about these in question and answer, we certainly can. There's a chapter on things that we should not say or reveal to people, and a chapter on things that we should, a chapter on polite lies, a chapter on gift giving and favors and advice giving, a chapter on neighbors, which I think is a really interesting topic. When you live near people, there's a lot that you have to pretend that you don't know about them, but at the same time, you also have to respond to their needs in particular ways. And then the last chapter, where I come back to forks and have something to say about that, is about hospitality, which I think of as a virtue. So let me just conclude by returning to Immanuel Kant, who's one of my favorite philosophers. So Kant, who shows up a lot in the book because he's one of my favorite philosophers, recognizes that when we think of, I mentioned at the very beginning that many people don't think manners are important, or they don't really want to adhere to them, in part because they think that they're hypocritical, that when you're putting on a polite face, that you're doing something that's sort of at odds with who you really are. And we all know people, probably, who are extremely polite but are complete jerks underneath. And this is something that Kant was troubled about. But the way that I understand him is that he thought, and Kant actually had a lot to say about why he thought good manners were important, that this, even though sometimes when we're presenting ourselves to the world as being more polite than perhaps we would actually be in private, this isn't necessarily a deceptive or hypocritical way of putting ourselves forward. Because it's the self that we're putting forward is a self that it may not be a reflection of how we actually feel right now, but it's a reflection of how we think we should feel, perhaps how we wish we would feel, or as I like to say, a reflection of our better self. That good manners are a way of putting forward the better version of ourselves, the self that we wish we could be at all times. And so when we say that we really like something in the present when we actually don't, right, or we're really happy for someone when in fact we're not, that we're not being hypocritical or deceptive necessarily. Instead, what we're doing is presenting our self to the world in a way that shows what we believe in, what we care about most. Kant recognized that there were some ways, many ways, in fact, in which good manners were a kind of illusion. But he thought that it was an important illusion. He actually called it a beautiful moral illusion. He thought it was an illusion that we had reason to foster. Because a world in which we behave properly to each other, in which we're civil to each other on the outside, brings us closer, he thought, to a world in which we treat each other well on the inside. So I'm going to close with a quote from Kant that I really like. And so this is from a book of his called The Doctrine of Virtue. Affability, sociability, courtesy, hospitality, and gentleness in disagreeing without quarreling are indeed only tokens, yet they promote the feeling for virtue itself by a striving to bring this illusion as near as possible to the truth. Thank you.
We have a microphone in the middle of the floor. If you don't wish to come to the microphone, please stand and yell your question. I'm sure we all have lots of them. I've thought about 45 since Karen started speaking, and this was maybe one of the most engaging and fastest Library Associates programs I've ever heard. So please, come forward with your questions. Thank you, Karen.
I should also say, for those of you who don't know any philosophers, that philosophers love to argue and be argued with, so feel free to argue or take issue with anything that I've said.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk tonight. And I'm really glad when I got the notification, I took my smartphone and I pressed it, and it went to a calendar, and it reminded me yesterday, and then I organized my day today to be with you.
I live by Google Calendar.
I was privileged to spend my 16th summer in Germany. Having grown up in a household where you could not put your hand on the table, I sat next to mother, German mother, and she sat me next to me because she wanted me to be a good German youth. And as I would put my hand underneath, she would grab and put it up. So all meals were about her trying to retrain me to be a German youth. Because evidently, I think that in Germany, you put your hands on the table because you're not going to steal either the silver or you're not going to grab for your knife and kill somebody.
Okay.
So, fast forward to today, I now have come to understand that in many cultures, having one's foot up is a real problem. And I love the idea in the spring of putting my foot on a railing at a Starbucks and just kind of relaxing. But now I can't do that because I understand the cultural problem with that. So can you tell us a couple of things? We're talking about Western manners here. The world is not just Western anymore, as we all know, and especially at Georgetown University. And so what, as we're proceeding, how much do we pay attention to all of the other truly different cultural events? And more importantly for me, when I find myself breaking somebody else's cultural event, what is a good way to be able to have the manners, as you deeply described it, to be able to right that wrong?
Yeah, that's a great question and a really complicated one, and one that I do try to address, although probably not enough length somewhat in the book. So the rules of etiquette, so things about, say, for instance, where your hands belong at the dinner table, or about whether you're wearing shoes and what you're doing with your feet, fall into the category of the rules of etiquette. And so they're, in my view, sort of conventions that are communication devices. Now, you may think, well, what's really communicate? I guess if you're in a culture where people might stab each other under the table, communicating, I'm not going to stab you, is very important. That doesn't, I hope, happen very often anymore, anywhere, although it probably does. In fact, Emily Post was actually really famous for keeping her elbows on the table because she said this just really isn't that important, quite frankly. So that makes me like her even more. But so some of those are going to be more important than others. And I do think, there is a problem about this, especially in intercultural society. So on the easier side, I think there's actually a sort of a moral obligation to read up on the conventions and customs of places where you're visiting, so you would know that, right? About, say, for instance, showing the soles of your feet in many countries, or about things like how you accept people's business cards, or eye contact. So I think that you do actually need to learn what you're saying with things, with gestures, when you go other places, so that you can try not to do that. Not all of that is really under your conscious control. So for instance, there's a fair bit of data about the kinds of distance that people in different cultures maintain from each other, physical distance, and it varies a lot by culture. Americans are some of the ones, I think only Australians keep more distance from each other than Americans do in conversation. So if you get too close to somebody, it's considered rude. And there's a lot of cultural variations in that, but that's not the kind of thing that people are really paying attention to, like how close am I sitting to this person? You do it naturally. So some of those things are going to be below the radar screen. And I think the only solution to that is to have a fair bit of charity toward other people, that people try their best to try to communicate what the other person will understand. So if you're trying to communicate respect to somebody, you need to figure out what they will take as a gesture of respect and what they will take as a gesture of disrespect. But at the same time, there's a need to flip back and see what is the person trying to communicate. Now, that works if you're talking about moving between cultures where there's one very distinct set of etiquette rules, another one where there's another one. And that isn't true for many places, maybe not even most places. And then I think it's really, I don't have a good answer to this. Actually, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Post is that she's writing etiquette rules, or she's writing etiquette books in a time where there's an awful lot of that very same thing. And she's presenting it. Now, she's presenting a very definite, this is the way you do things, right? It's not multicultural at all, in some sense. But it's a kind of a handbook in some ways. We don't have the same attitude toward cultural assimilation that people did in post-era. And I don't think any of us think that's really would be a good thing. I don't think I would want all of my neighbors to have to conform, who are from about 6 different countries, to have to conform to my standard. So I think it's a real problem. And it's particularly a problem where the conventions, so I mean, some of the conventions, it doesn't really matter to most people one way or the other. Like, for instance, what you do with your shoes when you walk into someone's house. Right? For most people, that's not really that big of a deal, one way or the other. So they're pretty happy to adopt certain kinds of conventions if they're visiting someplace and not others. It's not always that simple, though, because sometimes the conventions might be things that you're like, wait, I don't know if I want to buy this. This is particularly true with things like gender roles. Right? So, for instance, what clothes people wear in a culture should, what kinds of standards of dress, say, for instance, should Western women adopt when they visit certain countries, right, or vice versa. It does become much more complicated when it seems that abiding by another convention might either be disrespectful, you think might be a failure of self-respect, or disrespectful to somebody else, or expecting somebody to abide by a convention might be disrespectful. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, other than obviously people have to be charitable with it. But I think it's really, really important. It's even more important when we're talking about cross-cultural context, because to have some kind of understanding of the kinds of shared background commitments and recognizing that we need to convey those to people in ways they understand, I think is more important than ever. So I don't have a straightforward answer to that question. I do think it's a problem, but I think if anything, it just underscores the need for more communication about rules of etiquette, but maybe being less in the grip of them.
Thank you.
Psychologist.
Psychologist, yes. And as a philosopher, I'm able to argue with, and I'm at a double disadvantage. First, I'm not one. And second, I haven't read these etiquette manuals nearly as closely as you have. But let me try something, which is, when I think of Miss Manners, Judith Martin, I've never thought of her as a moral, taking a moral perspective. I think of her as being strategic. I seem to remember some weird Washington Post column from decades ago where she explicitly objected to Emily Post, saying that the idea of etiquette was to make people comfortable. Judith Martin said, no, it's not. Absolutely, that's not the idea. Some of my favorite of her columns really consisted of her giving people advice on how to make people really miserable.
Yeah. Only when they deserve it.
See, that's the point. She is always on the good guy's side. I mean, whether it's, planting travel books in the guest bedroom so people don't want to stay too long, or diabolically, she gives great advice to people whose spouses are cheating on them. She concocts these elaborate schemes on how to find ideas which will be repeated in the other woman's ear, which will make her look nasty, and bring down the whole house of cards. And so and her advice is always, whatever you do, don't do it comes naturally. Don't act like they've gotten to you or you've lost. The idea is to follow the rules, keep the form, and play with their minds in a way that will eventually bring them down. And I just wanted to see if you could comment on that general theme of her strategic side and how that plays into the moral sphere.
Yes. So one of her virtues is that she's really funny. And so I think some of that is that she's maybe sort of trying to be funny, but I think you were right, that she thinks that you can use rules of etiquette, and in fact should use them, for moral purposes. So for instance, responding to the racist joke, she's got some pretty good answers to that. Like, so she specifically says that she's not doing ethics and morality. I think she's wrong. I think she is, but never mind. But she does clearly think that you can, and perhaps even should, employ etiquette in such a way that it might have a particular kind of effect. And yet it does seem, hopefully, that she's on the side of the good guys. But it's hard to imagine, right, that you could be using rules of etiquette to embarrass someone or something, but she thinks you can. Now, I think there's a really big difference. This is one of the places where the sort of philosophical mindset of someone really matters. So the way I read Judith Martin is, I think she's a lot closer to Schopenhauer. I actually think she's something more like the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, right, who took the view that in his famous work, The Leviathan, he took the view, basically, that in the absence of civil society with with a sovereign power to enforce the rules, then all heck will break loose. So Hobbes says that in the natural state of nature, where there are no rules, things are really a mess. Everybody's out for themselves, everybody's out for their own survival, people gang up on each other. It's like sort of the original reality television show, that it's just everyone's out for themselves. And it's such a bad place that Hobbes thinks we have really good reason to hand over some of our rights to a sovereign who can keep people from killing each other. I don't know that Martin would take it quite that far, but I think that her view of human nature is something more like that. That manners are a way of, it's sort of, okay, we have to live with each other. We're sort of like the porcupines, we've got to be close to each other, but if we get too close, it's not going to be pretty. And that shows up a lot, I think, in her writing. Sometimes because she's trying to be funny, but sometimes because she does think that it's really about just trying to maintain order and make sure nobody stabs each other under the table. But that can be kind of hard to reconcile, though, with her idea. I mean, the way that she talks about the rules of etiquette, she sort of sees them as tools for fighting certain kinds of bias in some ways. Like, she sort of wants people to be like etiquette crusaders in some ways, or ethics crusaders. And that can be a little bit hard to square, perhaps, with that view. Now, Post, I think, I read as being more actually of a Humean, David Hume, who I mentioned before, that thinks that what the purpose of manners is to make things, is to be pleasant, to make them useful. Right? And so upsetting the status quo, I think, is a bigger deal for Emily Post than it is for Judith Martin, because of what she thinks the functions of manners are and what she thinks about underlying human nature. She doesn't take quite as dark of a view about human society as Martin does. And so what she does with the rules of etiquette are a bit different that way. I'm a fan, because I'm maybe, I don't know if I'm a Hobbesian, but I like what Martin does with the rules of etiquette and using them as a way of trying to instantiate moral principles in a variety of ways. So I'm kind of a fan of doing that. It is hard, though. You need a kind of justification for doing that. So what's your justification for using a rule of etiquette to shame someone? Well, I had thrown in there the line about, well, they have to deserve it, right? But as soon as you're in this realm of, well, how do we decide who deserves to be shamed? You know, it's Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you've got great Uncle so-and-so there who, after a couple glasses of brandy starts spouting off things that are going to really offend, cousin Liz over there, and what are you supposed to do about this other than keep them separate? It requires a lot of exercise of moral judgment, I think, about what are you going to do here? Is it more important to keep the peace because it's Thanksgiving and it'll upset grandma and she'll be, or is it important to stand up for it? And those, I think, are moral judgments. They're going to depend on the significance. What exactly is it that great Uncle so-and-so is saying, and what are going to be the effects of it? So now I've forgotten how I came back to that original question. But I think some of the differences between Martin and Post, although Martin is a fan of Post in many ways too, I think she is, but come down to actually what they think the point of etiquette, the differences, and what they think the point of etiquette is.
Well, I'd like to get to the microphone, but I'd have to step on people's feet to do it.
Oh, don't do it.
That would be bad manners. But let me ask you if you think this makes sense. I think you've made your point that manners and morals are linked. I think that you could argue that manners may be designed to make people more comfortable with each other, but that etiquette has a different function, that in fact it makes people uncomfortable, because etiquette is a way of showing respect, but only to a circumscribed group. Your etiquette peers, your own socioeconomic status or whatever. And so you show respect to them by maintaining standards of etiquette, but you separate yourself from all those who still wear their white shoes or can't use the right fork. And so you make those people uncomfortable, which is why people reject rules of etiquette, even though they think you should have good manners. You buy that?
So I think that some of those are going to turn out to be bad rules of etiquette, the kind that we should jettison, along with giving people titles in virtue of their skin color. It would depend on what it is. So actually sticking with titles, right? So there are rules. I don't know what they all are because I don't have a life that includes having to address a lot of diplomats. But I know there are rules about how one addresses diplomats and then the circumstances, your grace versus this or something, or writes letters to them. And because I don't need them, it's not very pressing to me. I think one could make the case that there are only some contexts in which we should employ those, maybe official contexts. But if you're just at a backyard barbecue, nobody should run around calling people your grace and so forth, and nor should people insist on it. So some of it will depend on what I think the hierarchies are doing. I think social hierarchies are a really interesting case in point. Because we like to, I mean, of course, America is not nearly as egalitarian as we like to think that we are, right? But we do believe in egalitarianism in many ways. And so there are circumstances in which employing rules of etiquette to sort of set yourself aside, right? Oh, I'm not one of those, right? I'm not the hoi polloi. I'm, part of this upper crust. There are many occasions, most of those occasions, I think, where that's going to turn out to be rude. So in my view, actually, it can be rude to follow an existing rule of etiquette if in doing that, you're undermining certain kinds of moral aims. So I think even though it might have been a convention at the time to address African American women by their first names and not with a title, where you wouldn't, it was still rude to do it because it was disrespectful, even though it was on the books. And I think that using titles or employing rules of etiquette, and actually Judith Martin thinks this as well, so as to embarrass people or put them in their place or separate yourself out, is rude. So it's a misuse of etiquette, she thinks, and I think that's right. Which is not to say that there aren't ever occasions on which that's important. I think there can be reasons to follow certain kinds of rules of hierarchy on occasion. I sort of like it when they do it in the House and the Senate sometimes. I mean, there's a sort of formality to it that I think is sort of nice. But in those cases, now I guess it would depend that you would draw a distinction between etiquette and manners, that you think manners are good but etiquette is not. Are you thinking of the rules of etiquette as those things that kind of enforce those distinctions?
Oh, I think so. I think etiquette often is used to separate one class from another and define us against them, which is why so many people react badly to etiquette.
I get this reaction a lot from friends who are British, especially if they're not part of the British upper crust, for some of that reason, because in many cases their experience of it depends on what the context is. Yeah, I'm sympathetic with that. If that's how etiquette is being used, then that's a case where it ought to be jettisoned. But I think there's a lot more to the rules of etiquette than that. And so maybe this is partly about what the term means and what the scope of it is. And I think a lot of it, sometimes lots and lots of debates come down to how people are using the words, actually, in philosophy and elsewhere. And this might be a case where that is happening. So I think of etiquette as being broader than that, but the kinds of things that you're talking about, those rules of etiquette, particularly if they're employed to do that, to sort of enforce social distinctions, then I think that they're bad rules of etiquette. And for moral reasons, we ought not to abide by them. That's what I would say.
Yes. Unlike your experience in Germany, I lived many years in France and was also involved with not having anybody put my hand, which was resting on my lap, onto a table because I was a different age than you were, the gentleman who spoke first. But the reason given that I should have my hand on the table was that, well, you don't know what the hand is doing underneath there. And I didn't kill anybody. It had to do with flirtation or self-harm. So that was rather interesting. When my husband and I became better acquainted with our newest son-in-law, we became very, very present to the fact that he thought he'd married into really a dreadfully bourgeois family because of ways that we chose to do things and how we looked at aspects of the wedding arrangements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been in a kind of working on this in terms of this free spirit chap who doesn't see quite why some of these things that we felt important could be important. And I'm delighted to have been able to find the Christmas present for him in your book.
I think it's good. Yeah, so criticizing people for bored, actually criticizing anybody for that. Judith Martin always points this out, that noticing someone's etiquette violation and commenting on it is itself an etiquette violation. So even if people are behaving really badly, you're not supposed to notice it anyway. She always points this out when people are afraid to have dinner with her because she's like, I'm not supposed to notice. Yeah, weddings, I don't know why, weddings just bring out etiquette debates. They said the one place where there are still etiquette, it's hard, if you go into Barnes, well, as long as there are still Barnes and Nobles, we go in there, like the etiquette shelf, it's all about weddings, something, and that's just a really interesting thing. Why people care about etiquette in the context of weddings, and not other cases, it's interesting. But one reason is that one of the things that you're, of course, trying to do in a wedding is bring together two families who might be from very disparate cultures. And so it's that intersection that often brings out a lot of the tensions and difficulties. And so perhaps it's not surprising that people turn to etiquette. Can we solve this problem about so-and-so not wanting to sit with so-and-so and all that as a way of trying to cope with it? It doesn't explain the sort of maybe the obsession with it, or the way in which in weddings sometimes people use etiquette rules as a way of trying to sort of squelch some people instead of others. And Martin actually is very opposed to this. But it might be precisely that you're trying to bring together people from different walks of life. And I do think that focusing on this, okay, there are the rules of etiquette, or these conventions, right, that are cultural and that can be lifted. And then there's what underlies them. There's the important principles that underlie them. Now, if there are disagreements about those underlying principles, then you have a problem. But in some ways, trying to get back to this, like, oh, okay, whether you take off your shoes or not, go out the door first or not, that's a matter of just how different cultures show respect, right? But they're all about showing respect. If you can get that far, of course, you can make a lot of progress, but that seems to be very hard to do in the context of weddings. I don't know why. But the idea that it shows, this is actually going back to the other question about the bourgeois values, right? The fact that in many cases etiquette does seem to get used as a status marker, like, oh, if you were brought up properly, you'll know to do this. And I think actually there's some sense in which I think that's true. I just don't think the notion of brought up properly is what other people think it means. I mean, brought up properly in the sense of being considerate and respectful, which of course is independent of socioeconomic status. That part's true. But I think that's also in part because people focus on things like facility with lots of fancy tableware that people may not have had exposure to. And it's not even that hard with forks, it's just outside in, you know, so it's not even, but no, I think that's true, that it becomes an issue. Like, it becomes a place where sometimes the debates about etiquette are really just about etiquette, but often there are debates about those underlying moral values, and etiquette just becomes like the focus there. We have time for one more question. Oh, there's several, but I'm not going anywhere, so everybody defer. Everybody was being polite.
This is a very simple factual situation that many of us come across all the time. And I'd like you, if you could, give me an analysis of why I feel the way I do.
I need Jerry here for this, a psychologist again. Yeah, okay.
Walking down from my home to the store is a sidewalk that is about wide enough for two abreast. I often travel on this way when kids are coming home from school. 7th graders, 8th graders. Walking down, and I'm walking one way, they're coming the other. They don't get off that sidewalk. I step off in the mud or the grass and let them pass by. And it doesn't bother me because I'm hale and hearty enough to deal with this. However, I was taught, you know, you respect your elders, whatever that means. And yet I might be healthier than they are walking down the street. I'm just wondering, how would you analyze the situation of deferring to someone of what, another age, or would you just say, look, I'm on the sidewalk, you'll have to deal with it?
So this happens to be one of my pet peeves. So even setting aside the age thing, so we're also setting aside the fact that, of course, people from different countries walk, they sort of yield on different sides. So let's assume that we're not talking about, like, okay, I'm an Australian, I can't remember if I go right or left. So we're assuming that everybody knows. We're in a culture where the default is to go to the right. I mean, I assume in that case that what people should know is there's basically an imaginary line running down the middle of the sidewalk, and that, you know, each person going one way is like traffic lanes or something. If you're taking up two of the traffic lanes, then you've got to, like, go back in independently of who the person is who's coming towards you. But that there might be reasons to do more than that on a narrow sidewalk or in one where there's a giant pothole or puddle, which happens a lot around Georgetown too, that you might be like, wow, that person walking toward me, right, is going to need more time, space to navigate around this for whatever reason, either because they're pushing a stroller or because...
what I meant was there are two students, though.
Yes, oh, that's what I mean, right. So they're basically the equivalent of taking up the whole of the traffic thing. So my sense is the default that this should be because it's shared space, right? And so if there's sort of one traffic lane, this is just how I resolve that particular problem. But the cause of it, I think in this case, so there's one question, and of course everybody, if you ride the metro, all these things come up, right? On who you give a seat to, and you don't want to offend anyone or so forth. That I think is pretty hard to navigate because people recognize, and certainly that men in this are familiar with this with regard to women because you just don't know. And sometimes it's age is a marker, like in what context should I open doors for people? This is something that's very complicated to sort out. That one strikes me as the problem is not really about so much not deferring because of age, but of just total and complete obliviousness, which of course lots of people are prone to, especially perhaps, not always, that's not fair to teenagers. Actually, I think there's a lot of problems of etiquette and morality too, or just plain obliviousness. I think you can explain a lot of what happens in the metro. People just aren't paying attention. They might, like if they were thinking, oh, there's someone coming toward me, I should defer. And you could easily get this out with something like Kant's Categorical Imperative. Obviously, universalizing the maxim of never yielding on the sidewalk is going to lead to a lot of concussions. So one question would be like, do they, I'm guessing in most of those cases, people just aren't paying attention. But if they were, especially if they were properly raised, they would defer, but not even on the grounds of age, but on the grounds of just, I'm only entitled to, the traffic going my way is only entitled to half the sidewalk. And of course, if there's cases where there's really only space for one person, then you have this question, who should defer on what grounds? And then it's a lot of things. It's who's there first, it might be age or what people are carrying or what shoes they're wearing. There could be a lot of things too. But in the case that you described, which I said is one of my pet peeves, I think it's just sheer obliviousness. I actually think there's a moral duty not to be oblivious, to pay attention, which is maybe a reason not to walk around attached to our cell phones because you're not looking up. I often tell students, because back in the days when I went to college, the only phones were attached to walls with cords, right? And so you couldn't there was nothing to take with you any place. So, I have my phone with me all the time too, but if you just sort of walking around campus, since I tell students, just look at what everybody's doing, right? Me too. We're all looking down at something. So there's one question about running into things and people too, and not talking, not having conversations with those people. But there's also just a heck of a lot of obliviousness about it. And so I don't think it's ill will in many cases. I think it's just they're just not paying attention.
No, there's no question.
Yeah.
I agree. That's not a nefarious intent or conspiracy.
Yeah. In terms of the rules, on what grounds do you defer? I don't know. I think that's really hard and changing. And in some ways, this is the same thing with elevators, right? Who gets on and off elevators first? We all know that there's sometimes a little dance and the elevator doors shut first. I think that's tough. I tend to defer on those cases, and I try to make my kids defer and get them to see that it's important to defer because they're kids and they're adults, but it's hard.
We could be here all night, and I wish we could be. Karen has graciously consented to signing copies of her book, so if you would like to engage with her further and chat, you can do so either at the reception that we have, or preferably picking up a copy of her book for a Christmas present or a holiday present, as this lady has done.
Or to embarrass someone.
Absolutely a wonderful evening, and I hope you will join me in thanking Karen Stohr.
Thank you.